The Great Cappadocians. Perhaps you have never met a bishop. 370 AD. Nicomedia on the Black Sea. Despite the ruling of the Nicene Council, Arian teachers continued to spread their beliefs throughout the empire. When Emperor Valens accepts the Arian doctrine, the situation becomes desperate for the Orthodox bishops. A weathered ship knocked against the dock where 80 bishops stood. Facing them, splendid in his gilded Roman armor, was Modestus, prefect of the emperor's personal Praetorian Guard. Behind him waited a contingent of the elite troops. They glanced at the darkening sky as thunder rumbled in the distance. "This isn't right," cried Bishop Urbanus. A stiff wind was rising off the sea, and he had to shout to be heard. "You invited all of us Nicene bishops here to debate with your Arian leaders, and instead you're exiling us? Doesn't Emperor Valens honor his word?" Modestus shrugged. "The emperor changed his mind. There aren't any Arians here for us to debate. He didn't change his mind. He planned this all along." Sneering, Modestus leaned closer to the bishop. "Valens is changing the face of the empire. The Nicene cause will soon perish, and the Arians will win." "You'll never win," insisted Urbanus. "God is still in control, and he won't allow the truth to perish." "You're right," snapped the prefect. "Fortunately, God is on our side." He ordered the soldiers to get the bishops aboard the ship. "If he is on your side, then why not try us in public? Why are we being sent away secretly?" Modestus ignored him. The veins in his neck bulging, he shouted, "Move! I want them on board before the weather gets too rough." Prodded by imperial spears, the bishops boarded the rocking boat. Urbanus kept an eye on the prefect, who had pulled the ship's captain aside. "Are we clear on the plan?" asked Modestus in a low voice. "Yes," answered the captain. "When do I get paid for my loss?" "When your duty is done. As soon as the boat is far enough out, the sailors are to lock the bishops in their cells and then burn it down." "They still think they're being exiled?" "Not for long," said Modestus with a grim smile. The crew raised the anchor and hoisted the sails, moving out to the swelling sea. Modestus watched from shore as a flame began to lick at the rigging and then spread across the deck. A lifeboat full of sailors rowed back toward the dock. Modestus turned and led his troops away as the cries of the trapped bishops reached the shore. The heavy rains came too late to save them. On a bright sunny day in the Cappadocian city of Caesarea, several presbyters stood talking in the doorway of the church. Lying between the northern waters of the Black Sea and the deep waves of the Mediterranean Sea, Cappadocia was a meeting point of all the main roads. News of the Eastern Empire came through Caesarea and into the church at the center of the city. "Emperor Valens is forcing Arianism on the bishops in Antioch," said Felix, a presbyter in Caesarea, "and he makes that dog Modestus do his dirty work." "I think Modestus is happy to do the dirty work," replied a presbyter named Demetrius. "The prefect is a cunning man. When he gets involved, he does it to promote his own interests, not just to please the emperor. Ever since he murdered the bishops on that ship 2 years ago, everyone is terrified of exile. How do we know it's not a death sentence? With the emperor planning to stop in Caesarea on his way to Syria, there is bound to be trouble here. But Valens and Modestus haven't dealt with Bishop Basil yet." They were interrupted by a booming voice behind them. "Wouldn't your time be better spent praying for the emperor instead of gossiping about him?" "Gregory of Nazianzus!" exclaimed Felix. "I didn't know you were in Caesarea. How is your father's church back home?" "Strong, and my father as well," said Gregory. "Would you excuse me? I've had a long journey. Where may I find Basil?" "He is over there with the dark-haired woman. We just buried her husband." "Thank you." Gregory headed across the courtyard. The young woman was dabbing at her eyes and talking to a man of medium height who stood as straight as a pole. A breeze made the man's long beard dance. He had aged since Gregory saw him last, but his eyes were alert as ever. When he caught sight of his childhood friend coming toward him, he said a gentle goodbye to the woman and hurried to meet Gregory. "How good it is to see you again," said Basil, embracing his guest. "I'm so glad you came." "How could I ignore your request?" Gregory replied with a smile. "Once the emperor arrives here, they will no doubt try to force you to accept Arianism. It's been a while since I joined you in a debate. You have not been to Cappadocia for some time. I was afraid if I showed up, you would force me to be a bishop somewhere." Basil looked at his friend in mock dismay. "Would I do that to you? You did it to your brother." The bishop's face was suddenly serious. "I was desperate, and there are few men we can trust to resist heresy these days," he said. My brother Gregory is struggling in Nyssa. He hasn't been there long, and he is a private man who hates public service. The enemies of the gospel are already attacking. The emperor is using his Arian allies to accuse Gregory of things he hasn't done. I don't know yet what will come of it, but he is fighting the good fight. Well, I'm here to fight too. I will stay as long as necessary to debate the Arians, but I'm not here to get one of your promotions. Of course, agreed Basil, his eyes twinkling. They went into the church and sat at the back of the sanctuary. You are in a powerful position here as Bishop of Caesarea, said Gregory, but the emperor's persistence is forcing many bishops to turn against Scripture. Basil turned to him resolutely. Many will give in, but the majority will not. Many have died for our cause, Basil, and you are as headstrong and outspoken as any. You must be careful. Indeed. But no more of this discouraging talk. You must have some good news to tell me. Have you heard from your sister? How is the teacher? The nickname brought another smile to Basil's face. Macrina is well, he answered. The women of her monastery are serious about living a godly life. I have not seen her lately, but her faith is like iron. Our faith may soon be tested, said Gregory. We would be greatly blessed if God grants us the strength of that woman. They shared a meal before Basil returned to his room. Removing his sandals, he knelt on the hard floor and began to pray for his church, for his brother in Nyssa, and for the trials he knew he would soon face. After an hour, he rose and pulled a small wooden box from behind his bed. Among the letters inside were several from Macrina that he saved for times when he needed encouragement. On top was one he read often. My dear brother, she had written, do not care for the things of this life. Don't be turned by sympathy for them. He replaced the letter in the box and stretched out on his hard bed, his arms folded over his chest. It had been a long time since he had seen her in Annecy, but images of his older sister stood firm in his memory. Her hair was gray now, her slim hands stained with years of hard labor in the monastery, but he had always believed her to be the most beautiful woman in the world. I nearly wasted my youth seeking the praises of this world, he thought. It was her strength and godliness that turned me to Christ. Seeing his old schoolmate and reading his sister's words prompted a rush of childhood memories. He came from a wealthy Christian family. His educated father had taught Basil and his siblings language and scripture and rhetoric at home, until he died while Basil was still a boy. His mother moved from their home in Caesarea to their country estate in Annecy, but she sent Basil back to the city to finish school and then to Athens. He had met Gregory of Nazianzus there. When he came home to teach rhetoric in Caesarea, Macrina scolded him for being vain. By that time, she had founded a community for women who wanted to spend their lives in prayer. He was still not used to seeing her plain clothes and simple life. His time was spent shining brightly in the academy and seeking a life of glory. He respected his sister, but he didn't see the need to follow her example. Basil, you are a brilliant man, but you think too highly of yourself, she told him when he returned from Athens. Your gifts come from God, and you should give him the glory. Why don't you use your gifts for the church? Becoming a famous teacher will honor the family name. Yes, but have you forgotten our heritage? Asked Macrina. Our grandparents survived the persecution of Decius. Our grandfather was a martyr for the faith. I haven't forgotten what our mother taught us, he snapped, but I am following the wishes of our father. The conversation echoed in his head like it was yesterday. He remembered the shock he felt soon after when he received word in his classroom that his brother Nacratius was dead. A hunting accident had cut short his life of dedication to the church. Basil began to reconsider his sister's warnings. It took my brother's death to teach me that my life belongs to God, he thought, closing his weary eyes. Macrina had welcomed him back to Annecy. Everyone called her the teacher. On the banks of the river Iris, surrounded by mountain forests, she had taught him to trust God and to pray. His old schoolmate Gregory joined him there, and together they founded a second monastery not far from his sister's. How different my life is now. I could never have known then that God would send me back to this city as bishop. It is so much work, but God will bless it, he told himself. Soon the Nicene cause will prevail. He rolled on his side and drifted into a troubled sleep. Many days passed. The city prepared to receive the emperor. Basil and Gregory held public debates with the Arians and spoke the truth to as many people as they could. One morning they were praying in Basil's sunlit office when Demetrius burst in. "Bishop, they've come for you." Basil came to his feet in surprise. Who? Modestus, said Demetrius, wringing his hands. Apparently the emperor sent him ahead to interview you and see if you are going to cause trouble when he arrives. If he insists I stop teaching that Jesus is God, then he'd better believe I'm going to cause trouble. When does he want to interview me? An escort is here now, and they insist you return with them. Modestus has no authority over me or this church, Basil declared, but it is an opportunity to speak the truth to my opponents. I'll go wherever God sends me, Basil said, striding towards the door. It is his cause I defend. Wait, Gregory insisted. I'm coming with you, but you must promise me something. Yes? Whatever happens, we do not board any boats. Basil grinned at his friend. They were escorted from the church to a private chamber in the imperial court. Several men in church robes sat in a row at the front of the courtroom. Modestus paced before them, his footsteps ringing across the tiled floor. This is a private interview. You will wait outside, a guard said to Gregory as they entered. I'm here of my own will and not by any order, Basil insisted. He is with me. He can stay until he opens his mouth, said Modestus behind him. Basil left Gregory at the back and stepped forward. The prefect and the bishop eyed each other suspiciously. Basil pointed to the clergymen. I thought this was a private interview. Who are they? They are bishops, and they will serve as witnesses to this discussion. They are Arians. Modestus gestured to a table. Have a seat. I wish to remain standing. So be it, said Modestus, clasping his arms behind his back. Haven't we met before? You came to me seeking tax relief for the Caesarean clergy? Basil waved his hand impatiently. Why am I here? The prefect gave him a haughty smile. Fine. If you wish to be direct, I will be direct. Tell us, Basil, are you a supporter of the Nicenes? If you are asking if I teach the creed of the Nicene Council, then the answer is yes. Then you accept the Nicene position? Basil faced him with confidence. I believe that Jesus is more than a man. He is fully God and fully man, not a created being as the Arians falsely teach. You will not be persuaded from this position. Basil folded his arms across his chest. Why should I be? This is the teaching of Scripture, confirmed by the Council of Bishops who met at Nicaea. The emperor and the bishops here today interpret Scripture differently. They are in error. Modestus arched an eyebrow and sneered. You dare to dishonor the beliefs of your emperor? My true sovereign is God, said Basil carefully. It is not his will for me to worship a created being. If Jesus is only a creature like me, I might as well worship myself. The Arian bishops began to whisper angrily. You go too far, Bishop. I don't think you realize the extent of my authority. Basil raised his chin. You don't have the authority of a church council. What can you do to me? I have the authority of the emperor, Modestus cried. I can take everything you own, exile you, torture you, or kill you. Is that all? Those things don't scare me. Of course they do. Don't try to impress me with your false courage. Basil stepped forward and looked straight into his interviewer's eyes. You cannot take from me what I do not have, unless you want these tattered rags I wear and a few books. You cannot exile me because every land belongs to God and I am his guest no matter where he takes me. And torture? Basil threw his hands in the air with a laugh. Torture is nothing. Torture is the friend who delivers me to my Savior in death. Modestus clenched his fists. No man speaks to me that way. Perhaps you have never met a bishop. Basil glanced meaningfully at the silent witnesses. In the corner, Gregory chuckled until the guard put a hand on his spear in warning. If you met a bishop, this is what he would tell you, Basil continued louder. We love to serve our emperors and obey the law. That is what God commands us to do. But if the emperor or his assassin places himself higher than God, we will defy your fire, sword, or wild beasts. When the interests of God are at stake, we care for nothing else. Modestus stared at him, his mouth open in surprise. His informants had told him that this local bishop was a Nicene, and he planned to depose him after a brief interview. But Basil was more powerful than he expected. This is not over, he declared. The emperor will arrive shortly, and you can be sure he will have something to say. He shot a contemptuous look at the Arian bishops and stomped away. The bishops scurried after him. You may be the first person who has ever stood up to that bully, Gregory exclaimed when they were out of earshot. I don't think it did any good, though. He's not going to just go away. No, especially after you embarrassed him in front of the Arians. What do you think he and the emperor will try next? I don't know, but they're not going to ignore Caesarea anymore. We're a target now. Valens arrived in Caesarea with great ceremony. The people thronged the streets, hoping for a glimpse of the emperor in his carriage. During the first weeks of his visit, there were parades and feasts, but no word from the court against the Nicenes. The presbyters in Caesarea began to think he would overlook them, but the blow Basil expected came soon enough. He had just dismissed a prayer meeting. The sun was going down, and the congregation hurried to get home before dark. The streets of any imperial city could be dangerous at night. Basil lingered to blow out the candles and say goodnight to the presbyters. When he stepped out into the cool evening air, he was greeted with a shout, "Bishop!" It was a familiar, unpleasant voice. He turned around slowly. Modestus was waiting on horseback with several armed guards. "Excuse me, Bishop," he said with polite disdain. "I have a letter for you." "You're a delivery boy now?" The prefect snarled and jumped off his horse, stepping quickly across the courtyard. "It's an order from Emperor Valens." "For me? Are you sure?" replied Basil, pointing to himself. "There must be others who deserve the emperor's attention far more than I." "I told you this wasn't over," Modestus said, shoving the parchment into the bishop's hand. "The emperor has decreed that you are to be exiled." Demetrius stepped out of the church behind Basil. Lanterns appeared in the shadows as some of the congregation turned back in curiosity. "The details are in the letter. Because the emperor is such a gracious man, you will have a few days to prepare." He leaned closer. "It looks like you'll get to keep your tattered rags and books after all." Basil tucked the letter into his belt, smiled, and continued on his way. Modestus turned abruptly back to his horse, and the people scattered, their lanterns bobbing across the dark streets. When the appointed day arrived, Basil said goodbye to Gregory, Demetrius, and the hundreds of people gathered outside the church. "I will pray for you, as you pray for me," he called to them. He raised his hands in blessing. "God give you the courage and wisdom to worship him in truth." "How dare the emperor do this?" someone cried. "Emperors come and go," said Basil with a smile. "I will be back." "Even the emperor cannot escape God's judgment," assured Gregory. As the people pushed forward to touch their bishop, a carriage screeched to a halt beside the church. "I'm ready to go," Basil called out to a soldier on horseback. "The emperor has changed his mind," said the soldier. "His son is terribly ill. You are ordered to the palace to pray for the boy's healing." Basil looked at Gregory. "This could be another of Modestus's tricks," Gregory whispered. "It could be, but it could also be a marvelous work of God." He nodded to the soldier and climbed into the carriage. "Don't worry, Gregory," he called out the window as the horses were urged into a gallop. "The carriage is not on fire." At the palace, Basil was rushed to the emperor's private apartments. Valens was dressed regally, but wore the haggard look of a worried father. "He seems to have improved just since I sent for you," the emperor said, rising from his couch. "Will you pray for him?" "Let me see him first." He was led into the child's room. When the doctor stepped aside to let him pass, he was surprised to see a line of Arian bishops standing before the bed. "Why are they here?" he demanded. One of the bishops held a basin of water. "We are ready to baptize the child before he dies." Basil glared at him, and then at Valens. "You would baptize your son as an Arian, yet you bring me here to call down God's healing?" "I take no chances with my son's life." The emperor folded his arms across his chest. Basil waved the bishops away and approached the bed. The child was pale and shaking with fever. He leaned over the bed and took the child's hand in his. "Father," he prayed silently, "Valens is an enemy of your church, but this boy is just a child. There is still hope that he will serve you one day. If it be your will, restore him to health even now." Then he turned back to the emperor. "God struck down Pharaoh's firstborn because he would not let Israel go. Now God has brought this calamity upon you because you have killed his faithful ministers. As long as you continue to defy the truth and harm the church, your house will feel God's anger." The boy moaned. Valens put a trembling hand over his eyes. "Take Basil home," he ordered. Basil walked out of the room, but when he reached the door, he turned back and saw that the bishops had surrounded the bed. He met the emperor's weary eyes. "To side with the Arians is to bring death to your house," he declared quietly. The guards carried him out. But he was stopped by a soldier before he reached the street. "There is sickness in the palace, Bishop," he said. "Your presence is requested." "I've already been there, soldier," Basil replied. "I'm sorry that the emperor's son will not survive." He turned to go. "No, sir," said the soldier, gripping Basil's shoulder. "Not the emperor's son. It's Modestus. prefect of the Praetorian Guard. He begs you to come pray for him. Modestus is ill? Very ill, sir. Please come with me. He led the way to the prefect's apartments. Modestus was lying in his bed, shivering like the child Basil had just seen. Why don't you call your Arian friends? Basil said coldly. They are still here, sacrificing Pharaoh's firstborn. Please, Bishop, Modestus cried, raising his head with a great effort. I am near death, and I have repented of my sins. There was a sincerity in his voice that made Basil step closer. Basil, you have won your argument. Only grant me recovery. Moved, the bishop knelt at his bedside and prayed that God would heal this man who had been his enemy. Gregory greeted Basil with relief when he returned to the church and listened with amazement to his report. But they were saddened the next day when word arrived that Valens' son was dead. If only he had not mingled salt water with fresh, Gregory said, and invited you and the Arians to his bedside, perhaps God would have answered your prayer. The empire was quiet for several weeks. Is it true that Modestus has recovered? Demetrius asked Basil. That is what I am told. In his grief, Valens is staying out of the public eye, Gregory said. Rumor has it that he regrets having allowed the Arians to baptize his son. He seems to have backed down from forcing the Nicene bishops to accept Arian teachings. We'll see if that lasts. In the meantime, we have lost a good many bishops who need to be replaced. He looked at Gregory. I have some reading to do, Gregory said, rising. Excuse me. Basil stood. We need you at Sasima, Gregory. You know we need an Orthodox bishop there. I am not qualified for such a position, Gregory insisted. I said no, and I mean no. His hasty footsteps clattered down the hall. I think that's a no, Demetrius said. Basil looked at the empty doorway. He'll go to Sasima. He has devoted as much to the cause of truth as I have, and he knows we need him. But I'm afraid our friendship may become a casualty of this battle. Basil was right. Gregory became Bishop of Sasima at Basil's insistence, but it caused a division between the two friends that lasted until Basil's death. Basil died in 379, and Macrina followed not long after. Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory of Nazianzus carried on as leaders of the Council of Constantinople in 381, which outlawed Arianism. Macrina, Basil often called Basil the Great, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus became known to history as the Great Cappadocians, defenders of Orthodox Christianity.